Brooklyn and Ethan had been together since their college days. Back then, Brooklyn was being courted by two young men, Ethan and his friend Mason. Both men claimed Brooklyn's love, but in the end, she chose Ethan. He was more serious and hardworking, while Mason was charismatic but lacked a serious mindset. Over time, Brooklyn began to think about their future together and wanted a serious relationship. Their relationship grew quickly, and they recently married. For the first few years of their marriage, everything seemed calm. However, as time went on, Brooklyn began to criticize her husband more often. They were thinking about their future together and wanted a serious relationship. Their relationship grew quickly, and they recently got married. Their daughter Paisley celebrated her 7th birthday for the first few years of their marriage. Everything seemed calm, but as time went on, Brooklyn began to criticize her husband more often. She often compared him to the husbands of her acquaintances who had already started families. Brooklyn was tired of hearing about how these husbands overwhelmed their wives with gifts, often took them on vacations, and lived more interesting lives. She felt that her own life lacked excitement. It revolved around work, managing their small apartment, and taking care of the baby. Taking care of the baby and running the household seemed to Brooklyn to be a pretty routine and monotonous existence. One day, she started nagging her husband again about not advancing in his career. She compared him to the husbands of her friends who had started successful businesses and were making good money. Brooklyn's constant complaints drove Ethan to the brink. And that night, their discontent a few days later, Ethan was at work when he got a call from his university friend Mason. They hadn't talked much, but Mason was in a good mood and asked how Ethan was doing after a quick chat. Mason then told him he was inviting him and his wife Brooklyn to his birthday party. The following Friday, he promised a great party with lots of guests and fun. He urged them not to miss it, and they readily accepted the invitation, already imagining how they would spend the evening together. They really went out, and he hoped it would be a nice break for Brooklyn, who had been a little cranky lately when Ethan shared the exciting news with Brooklyn. He was surprised and pleased when she set aside her negativity and happily agreed to come. He decided that this outing was just what she needed on Friday night. They arranged for their daughter Paisley to stay with her grandparents and went to Mason's apartment. It was spacious with a modern design. The living room was full of guests having a great time. There were even a few familiar faces from their college days. As the evening went on, everyone congratulated Mason and asked about his work. They were happy to hear that things were going well for him. Ethan chatted with the guests while Brooklyn seemed really interested in him. She watched him closely, noting how successful in content he had become since their college days. The alcohol flowed, and as the guests arrived one after another, Ethan began to feel quite depressed, as he was not used to drinking so much to avoid embarrassment. He retired to another room and lay down on the sofa to rest. The party went on. Anne and Brooklyn chatted with her classmates, one of whom was telling her about his life, making Brooklyn wonder about their past together. She still couldn't understand why things didn't work out between them back then. She cast him a meaningful glance, feeling the effects of the alcohol. Mason took her words quite literally. As they made their way to his bedroom, old feelings resurfaced as they began to kiss. In that moment, Brooklyn felt no sense of guilt or hesitation. She was already living the life that Mason had so beautifully painted. In the next room, amid the noise of the party guests, it all happened in an instant. She cheated on her husband for the first time. Even with his friend later, Ethan was awakened by the loud laughter of the guests. Glancing at the time, he decided it was time to leave. Entering the living room, he saw that his wife was sitting with a glass in her hand, immersed in her thoughts. Distracted by his own sleepiness and feeling sick, she didn't notice him. Ethan said goodbye to the party, had a few drinks, and caught a cab home. He was out like a light as soon as his head hit the pillow, while his wife stayed up in the kitchen for a while before going to bed. About a month had passed since this incident, and Brooklyn was gradually communicating less and less with her husband, often leaving to Ethan finally mustered up the courage to talk to her. Only to be met with some surprising news. Brooklyn suddenly exploded, spewing out all her accumulated resentments. She started by complaining about her standard of living, then moved on to domestic problems, and finally she told him she wasn't attracted to him anymore. The husband joked that then who was she attracted to? To his surprise, the wife replied, Mason. After such a revelation, it was no longer possible to remain silent. The wife expressed her dissatisfaction with her life with Ethan and said that she wanted a completely different life. She told him she was leaving him for Mason. She said she'd already told their daughter she was going to stay with Mason since she was already asleep. Her husband was careful not to raise his voice when they talked about the baby. When he asked about their daughter, she said they decided that later and went to pack her things. Her husband tried to have a heart-to-heart with her. To be continued. Heart-to-heart turned to his now wife. But he was ignored. Ethan started divorce proceedings. And during all this time, the wife only visited their child once. It was obvious that she wasn't interested as she quickly returned to her lover. She didn't even request custody of her own child. Maybe Mason wasn't keen to become a father? Or maybe Ethan didn't want his daughter to grow up with a stranger. He ended up living alone with their daughter. Ethan was left alone with their daughter, Paisley. He found it difficult to answer her questions about her mother, but she eventually figured it out. Brooklyn was happy with her new life and her lover, but this happiness didn't last. Mason proved to be incompatible with married life. He still wanted to enjoy life without commitment. Brooklyn began comparing him to her husband, Ethan. She realized that Mason wasn't as bad as she had previously assumed. After 6 months, Brooklyn realized that Mason wasn't as bad as she thought. She ended the relationship and started looking for reasons to see her husband when she met her daughter. She tried to get Ethan's sympathy by saying things like, "Maybe we should go out and ask your dad, or let's have dinner together one day." When Brooklyn's daughter ran off to her room, Ethan told her to stop. He said he didn't want her interfering in his life anymore. He asked her to see their daughter, but not to ruin their lives or create unnecessary stress in pursuit of short-lived life changes. Brooklyn left her family and got involved with someone new. However, such unstable unions usually fall apart quickly, and it is often impossible to regain the trust of loved ones who have been abandoned. In the end, everyone gets what they deserve.